Hello, everyone. How you doing? My name is Zac Sgro, one of the pastors at Neighborhood Church, and I want to thank you for taking the time to tune in either through our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. Today, we are exploring session 3 of emotionally healthy relationships and diving in a bit further to our family trees, technically termed the Genneagram. But before that, I have one quick announcement for you, and that's this. We, as a neighborhood church leadership and team, was hoping to be able to share with you what a neighborhood church relaunch or replant would look like in 2021 and beyond at the end of this month on the fifth Sunday, January 31st. However, as we've thought, we're going to need a bit more time to hone in on what God wants for this church, to prayerfully and discern what he has for us in regards to what a new vision, mission, and values would look like, how we will organize our church structure and our church life. And so I'm just asking that you guys would bear with us a bit longer to where we can have all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed and eventually call together an all church gathering, hopefully by the end of February or maybe even by the end of March, and share with you what the future of neighborhood church will look like in 2021 and beyond. But for today, we're going to jump back and we're going to jump into the lesson. So if you remember from last week, we learned what it looked like to stop mind reading and to start clarifying expectations. And today we add yet another building block to learning how to have emotionally healthy relationships in session 3 of EHR. And that's looking at our family tree, or what I already said, a Genneagram. The session is designed to help us look back and see how our family history, how our parents, our grandparents, and even great grandparents impact who we are today. And they do so in both a positive and negative way. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to concentrate on the negative aspects. I'm going to concentrate on the negative aspects because there's a phrase we find first in Exodus chapter 20, and it's when God is giving Moses the commandments, and we come across this phrase that can be a bit tricky for us to understand, but I'm going to read it to you and then give you an idea of what it means, and then show you how what it means impacts the family throughout the generations. And so that phrase first shows up in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, and it's this. I know you guys will remember hearing it as soon as I read it. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. I'm going to read it one more time, this phrase. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. This phrase appears again in Exodus chapter 34 and again in Deuteronomy chapter 5, right after or during when Moses is reciting the commandments to the nation of Israel. And there's lots of conjecture about what this means. Some think it means that curses will be passed down the family lines, affecting generations into the future. Others think that children and future generations will pay for the sins of their parents and grandparents and so on and so forth. But in reality, what God is showing us here, and there's some Hebrew language that makes the English translation a bit tough, is that the sins that let's see here, that God is not punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation, but the sins of the parents and the great grandparents and so on and so forth tend to be repeated to the third and fourth generation. The sins of the parents tend to be repeated to the third and fourth generation, or as what Pete Scazzero would say, is what happens in one generation often repeats itself in the next. And so to illustrate this, we are going to look at the family tree of Abraham and Sarah. You guys all know that story. Abraham first appears on the scene in late in Genesis chapter 11, under the name Abram. He later gets his name changed to Abraham, and Sarai later gets her name changed to Sarah. They first appear, and the story really gets kicked off in Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abraham to leave where he's at, to go to a place that he would show him, that he will make him into a great nation, and that through his offspring, the world would be blessed by him. And Abraham and Sarah both understand that this is going to require them to have a child. And they are pretty old at that time. And furthermore, Sarah is barren. She cannot have children. And so, as you guys know, the story goes on. I'm going to share with you a few quick tidbits, and then we're going to dive into what the family tree actually looks like. But whether it's because of a lack of faith, a lack of trust, who knows, Sarah during this time offers Abraham Hagar, her Egyptian slave, to have a kid. Whether she wanted to move the promise on from God a little bit, she felt the need to intervene and help a little bit. Well, as you know how the story goes, Abraham sleeps with Hagar, and they eventually have a child. His name is Ishmael. Now, just that one instance, how much pain and suffering would that put on a marriage between Abraham and Sarah, and even Hagar for that matter? Add into the fact, these next two bits of information, how during this story that Abraham not once but twice lies about his wife Sarah being his sister, and seeks to do what amounts to be prostituting her out, first to the Pharaoh of Egypt, and then later in the story too, I believe it's King Abimelech. And so imagine the pain and strife that can cause when Abraham gives his wife up 2 times. And so it's a bit of a difficult scenario that you can see here, that if those two do not deal with what has occurred in their life properly, how it can be passed down. And I want you to actually think about that right now before I share my screen with you to show you the actual family tree. And just think of how those 3 instances could potentially impact the family. And so while you're doing that, I am going to share my screen. I believe it will work here, as I've done this a few times. And what you're seeing on the screen here is the family line. And I'm going to explain it here with you and highlight a few of those sins that seem to be repeated to the 3rd and 4th generations. And I'm going to use my pen here. And so hopefully all of this works. I'm going to switch colors. I'm going to start with the first one. Favoritism seemed to have typified this family line. Obviously, you know the story between Hagar, Abraham, and Sarah. They eventually have a child. His name is Ishmael, and that's Abraham's favorite. It's his firstborn. Naturally, it's his favorite. Later, Sarah and Abraham eventually have a child, of which, for obvious reasons, it's Sarah's favorite. She shows favoritism toward Isaac, and eventually asks, sometime during the story, she asks Abraham to kick Hagar and Ishmael out of the family. So imagine that, if you will. Eventually, Isaac marries Rebekah. They have Esau and Jacob. Esau is Isaac's favorite. Jacob is Rebekah's favorite, and down through the family lines. I'm not going to get into all of it, how all these relationships work out, but Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines, eventually having Joseph, the 11th of 12 sons, and that is his favorite. So this family is marked by favoritism, repeating the sins to the 3rd and 4th generation. Next, deceit and lies typify this family. Obviously, I shared with you how Abraham lied about Sarah being his sister and sought to give her away twice. Isaac repeats that same exact sin in his relationship with Rebekah. Going on further, they have a child. His name is Jacob. He is called heel grabber, or that name means deceiver. And his life is marked by deception. And in a little bit, I'll move on and I'll share with you kind of the situation that Rebekah and Jacob teamed up to deceive their father, Isaac. We can look at further relational brokenness, marked by the yellow line. The relationship between brothers, Ishmael and Isaac, was cut off. Obviously, the strife and brokenness between Jacob and Esau. And then the 12, and we have the story about how the brothers hated Joseph. His dad gave him the coat of many colors, and they wanted to kill Joseph, but instead They threw him in a pit. They took the coat of many colors. They slaughtered a goat. They put blood on the coat, and then they showed that coat to his dad, and they said that Joseph was eaten by a ferocious animal, when in reality what they did was sell him into slavery to the nation of Egypt. And then they lived out that lie for almost a decade. Can you imagine that? Relational brokenness, even deception and lies there. And then finally, I don't have to go too far with marital brokenness. All the pain and strife as you look at just that scenario right there. And then we move into the relationship between Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob, and Rebekah's favoritism towards Jacob led her to cook up a scheme to have her son dress up like Jacob so that he could receive his father's blessing instead of Esau. And then look here, we've got not one, not two, not three, but we've got four, two wives and two concubines that Jacob has. What sort of dynamic do you think was going on there? Let your imaginations run wild. And if you want to go and read the story to see what actually happened, it's probably close to what you're thinking about. That's crazy. Look at that family tree. Just take 2 to 3 seconds to look at all the sin that's being repeated to the third and fourth generation. So you may ask, what's the point? Their family tree is just as jacked up as mine is. It's just as jacked up as yours is. What's the deal? Well, eventually, Joseph is able to break that cycle. And he's able to break that cycle because he has a relationship with God that seemingly no one else in his family had. And that relationship that he had with God led to his family being restored, and the relationships being reconnected. It led to a nation, the nation of Israel, being saved, and the preservation of the family line that would eventually see the birth of Jesus Christ, the one who is the great chain breaker, the cycle of sin breaker, who Jesus was born into the family of humanity so that he could bring beauty from the ashes of our broken family lines. And so that through Christ and our relationship with him, we could begin to break the cycle of sin being repeated to the third and fourth generation. And so while it's beyond the scope of this video to get into how that exactly happens, if it's something that's piqued your interest, reach out to us, send us a private Facebook message. We can help you, or at the very least, purchase Pete Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality book. Chapter 3, I think, is the one that details this a little bit more. And so I hope that gives you guys a little bit more of a view into what that phrase means, and the importance of looking at our Geneagram, our family tree, and how that impacts us today. And so, as always, may you all go in the grace and peace and mercy of Jesus Christ. Bye-bye.